Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Social Europe videocast. And my name is Robin Wilson. I'm the editor of Social Europe, and with me today is Jenny Andersson, a professor in history of political thought at Uppsala University in Sweden. And Jenny is going to talk to me about social democracy in Sweden in the context of a project which is supported by the Foundation for European Political Studies, Progressive Studies, and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Jenny, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Let's begin, Jenny, by going back to a classic book that you wrote, The Workshop on the Library, or The Library and the Workshop, rather, about the state of social democracy in Sweden with the comparison of Britain in mind. And in that book, you suggested that social democracy in Sweden, which obviously was very successful in the European context, arguably the most successful in the European context, but you argued in that book that social democracy in Sweden had rather lost its way. And I wonder whether you think now, a little bit later in time, some years later, whether you think that's still the case, or whether you think there are some positive trends in the Social Democratic Party in Sweden that we should be aware of. Obviously, people have pointed to rising inequality. They pointed to the inegalitarian effects of the system of educational choice introduced by the moderates in Sweden, but accepted by Social Democrats. And they've also raised questions about the privatization of social care. But what's your take on the current situation, particularly with an eye to the elections coming up in September?
Well, when I wrote this book, which is now a fair few years back, I was not aware of, and I don't think that many people, some were certainly, but not many people were aware of the galloping trends in inequality in Sweden. So I guess we became aware of that with an OECD report maybe 5 or 6 years back, and that trend did not stop then, but it's become steadily worse since. So this is today an acute phenomenon, a really important problem. Sweden is at the top of the league in the inequality statistics in the OECDs. It's by far the most unequal country of the Nordic countries. So there are different ways of looking at this piece of statistics. One way is to look at the lower part of the income spectrum, where you have a kind of steady decline in real revenue of poorer households. The other way, which is the more shocking way, actually, is to look at the very upper part of the spectrum, where Sweden today has the fastest growing number of billionaires. Sorry, I was going to say millionaires, but that's wrong. Billionaires in the world. So that's a kind of shocking piece of statistics. And that obviously is a development that was fueled by many of the economic policies that I did talk about in the book, by the turn to what was called the knowledge economy, which was always a kind of high-end idea. All economic innovation and growth, and sort of always presumed that knowledge-led growth would kind of filter down towards the lower levels of the population, which is not actually true. We know today that human capital investments got stranded at the upper income classes, and I think that's something that we've really witnessed in Sweden. So one of the explanations, behind this billionaire phenomenon is exactly sort of very productive innovation industry. Some of them are in the tech business. Some of them are things like Spotify, for instance. Other huge fortunes have been made, in fact, in what I call the welfare industry. So the private companies that are today active in the welfare state in Sweden, and that have had huge margins in terms of profit in the last years because of demographic changes in Sweden. So do I think that things are better? No, I do not think that they are better. I think that there's been positive changes in the party. So I guess one of the kind of bottom lows was the so-called January deal, which is now 3 years back. where social democracy, for reasons to do with the fragility of electoral support, was put in a situation of having to accept a set of things that came from the center right, the liberal right in Sweden, and that turned out, I think, very electorally costly and also fragilized the party even more from within. And at least one of the effects of that was to trigger a conversation inside of the party. It also triggered a new organization within the party, sort of very much like Podemos in Spain or Momentum in Britain, called Reformistana. And Reformistana has been a very successful group within the party. So there has certainly been a shift in debate, and there's been a return, not least, in fact, by Magdalena Andersson, who has personally really given voice to the theme of inequality, and who has at least said on a couple of occasions that she would very much like to see this trend stopped, and that she would like, for instance, to reintroduce forms of taxation for the very richest and reintroduce forms of capital gains tax, for instance. But the electoral situation is still extremely precarious. And I think that a debate that did begin about restoring welfare state services, constraining the room for maneuver of the private welfare actors, including capping their profits, not necessarily stopping their profits, but capping their profits and putting in place new regulations on shareholder actors in the welfare state. That was a debate that had begun very clearly. And I, along with many other people, thought it would be the defining issue for the coming election in September. And alas, I don't think it will be at all, because the NATO situation has completely now overwhelmed Swedish politics.
Well, we'll come to NATO in a moment, Jenny, but you mentioned Magdalena Andersson there, and I wanted to ask you about her assumption of the leadership of the party, because it's reflected a trend in the Nordic countries of feminization in the leadership of social democracy. And I wondered what your thoughts were generally on that trend and its significance for Europe as a whole.
I'm not convinced that it means all that much, frankly. I think that, for instance, Sanna Marin in Finland is a very popular figure in Finnish politics. I think she stands as a kind of national icon in a way that Magdalena Andersson so far does not. Magdalena Andersson is a very competent party leader, a very competent economist, former Minister of Finance, was for a long time the advisor of the former party leader and Prime Minister Göran Persson, very much the architect of many of the Swedish third way reforms under his during his time. And she also happens to be a woman, but I don't see that the gender question is the defining aspect of her leadership. I actually think that she's a pretty hardcore politician. She believed firmly in the third way reforms. She's demonstrated that time and time again, although I think that this terrain is shifting, and I hope that Magdalena Andersson is someone also who will continue to shift that terrain. But I don't see in any way that the feminization of the leadership issue would bring back the heart issues of social democratic politics, of care, for instance. I don't think those were ever Magdalena Andersson's key concerns. And that to me is fair enough. I would love to see Magdalena Andersson very clearly on an economic policy platform to reduce inequalities, and on hard issues like taxation or like EU policies or monetary reform. I think that would be terrific.
One of the trends, certainly in social democratic party behavior in recent years, Jenny, has been a shift in their voting constituency in gender terms towards a stronger proportion of women being involved. And how do you think the Swedish party performs in that regard, in recognizing that? And do you think that, again, there are any lessons to be learned elsewhere among social democratic parties across Europe in how they specifically address the concerns of women? For example, one of the points that has been made in a number of people is there needs to be a greater focus on the care economy, and a recognition that that is kind of central to the lives of women in a way it's not been historically for men. But what's your view on that, and on how social democracy can relate more effectively to an electorate that is much more female than it used to be?
Yeah, I guess that the Nordics would be on a different timeline from many other countries, like, say, New Zealand, for instance, because the care economy was, is a 100-year-old concern in the Nordics. So it's not a theme that female party leaders have brought in. And there are a lot of gender dynamics going on in social democratic politics, and also in the Swedish and Nordic electorate. One of the really important gender dynamics is the right-wingization, obviously, of working class men. So I'm not sure what the causality in the trend is. Is it women turning to social democracy, or is it a feminization of the electorate because some of the male electorate has been leaving, mainly to the right, not only to the right, but mainly to the right? But it is true that the welfare issues, the care issues, have a very strong female echo in the female electorate. Social democracy in Sweden has had a heavy competition here, I would say, from the left party, which is by far the most outspoken advocate for those kinds of issues. And I think that reflects also in the electorate. So the electorate of the left party is more feminine than the electorate of social democracy, I think.
Well, that raises two interesting points, Jenny. First of all, on the far right, obviously in Sweden, there's been the dramatic growth in recent years of the Sweden Democrats. And these parties, as you've hinted, have even been referred to elsewhere in Europe as the Männerpartiet, the men's parties, because for authoritarian men, they seem to have a particular attraction. What do you think social democracy needs to do to be able to reverse the rise of these authoritarian populist right-wing parties like the Sweden Democrats?
I think that we need to stop playing on their part of the field. I think that we need to go back to issues that have to do with reformist politics, and that means, for instance, tackling the macroeconomic framework. It means allowing for budgetary investments and for restoring investment politics in a whole set of the economy, which, by the way, is I think really the program now of social democracy for the election is investment into fossil-free steel is a very big thing now in Sweden. Also, really heavy investments into battery production, for instance, for electric vehicles. So there is really a bit of a green industrial policy revolution. And I think in connection to that, moving the front line on all of these issues that have caused the kind of inequality that I think is an explanatory factor also behind a turn to the far right, which is that large numbers or large groups in Swedish society felt, in fact, that they were abandoned by the welfare state and by social democracy as a party too. And I think that is the way to do this, is to do whatever can be done to restore equality levels, and it has to start with economic policy. So Magdalena Andersson is very well placed for that. And it has to be, I think, bringing back the questions that are about care and investment into the welfare state. But the welfare state in Sweden today has to allow for the fact that Sweden is not a white country, is a country that is composed by a very important segment of immigrant population, is a country that received 200,000 people in 2015 very quickly, is a country that today is receiving Ukrainian refugees like Poland and Denmark and Germany and so on. So we also have to think the welfare state as something that is not is not the property of the white working class male. And what I think is a mistake, and has been a mistake in Sweden and in many other social democratic parties as well, is the idea that when the far right is making headway in the electorate, you need to adopt their positions or you need to echo their discourse. But I mean, this is now a very significant part of the population. It's a very significant part of the electorate. So I think that is quite simply not working. It only plays into their argument. So I think that should come to a stop. Then there are a set of very difficult issues. It's very difficult to think about how to maintain the quality of what we like to call a universal welfare state for a population that is where the most fragile groups, in fact, are not necessarily even Swedish citizens and are people who lack legal status and so on. That is a very difficult problem, and that should be in the things that we think about too.
I'm going back to what you said about inequality. My understanding of the statistics, Jenny, would suggest that apart from the growth of wealth, the top of the spectrum, one of the factors behind inequality rising in Sweden has been the impoverishment of those on the margins of the labour market, of whom there have been rather more in recent decades than in the past. And obviously migrants and refugees would be one of the groups who comprise that population. You also mentioned there. Sorry.
No.
You also mentioned there, Jenny, earlier the Left Party, and I also wanted to ask you about coalition politics. Obviously, right across Europe, we're moving away from the days when Social Democrats could think of themselves as mass parties with huge vote banks who could essentially vote on their own, all with some token support. Now we're talking about coalitions with other left parties and green parties, or indeed in the German case with the Liberals. What's your sense of where progressive coalition politics will go in Sweden, perhaps, with the aftermath of the September election in mind?
Well, I think that's the $1 million question. I think that an assertive social democratic party has the power to define alliances in a different way than in 2018. So in 2018, in the January Treaty, social democracy had to give up a lot. And a very small party in Swedish politics, the Center Party, which is really sort of hovering around the limit for parliamentary existence, that's a slight exaggeration, but in any case, was given a proportion, an influence that was disproportional to its actual electoral score. So I'm hoping that we don't see a repeat of that. I think Magdalena Andersson is extremely cautious of that. But what also happened in 2018 was that social democracy had to accept to treat the left party like the Sweden Democrats, that is, as an undecent democratic player. So the left party was excluded from the January deal. That, I think, was absolutely devastating, because I think that in a time of extremely fragile electoral majorities, social democracy cannot afford to think about a pro-welfare state party, pro-egalitarian party like that. And so ideally, I think we could see a social democrat, green, left alliance with some component of the Center Party, which is the former Agrarian Party, which is kind of a little bit like the middle of the road, but which has also turned to a quite far interpretation of neoliberalism in some of its economic policies. But the Center Party has an historic electorate that is very pro-welfare state, and that historically feels an affinity to social democrat voters. So that would be a possibility, but it really all depends. And it doesn't all depend on social democracy. It also depends a lot on the Swedish right, which has its own set of existential dilemmas and which has also been fractured by the existence of the Sweden Democrats. And the Center Party is one of the few players on the right that has very clearly said it did not want to govern with the Sweden Democrats. And then it seems to me a logical alliance would be an actually liberal left or a center left alliance. But that was not the case in 2018, and it really will depend a lot on even very small changes in parliamentary majorities.
Finally, Jenny, I can't talk to you today without asking you, of course, about the issue of neutrality, because it's been such a shock to the Swedish social democratic system, if you like, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the way that has led to a dramatic change in thinking about neutrality from the traditional view that social democrats took, which saw neutrality as the inherently progressive policy to adopt on international security issues. Given that now Sweden is in the process of joining NATO, as with Finland, in response to what's happened in Ukraine, what do you think now that a progressive international security policy for social democrats looks like if neutrality isn't what it is anymore?
That is a very difficult question, and I think it would have been great if we had spent 10 years thinking about that, which clearly we did not. I think that a lot of people in and around social democracy and in general in Sweden today have extremely mixed feelings about this. So obviously there was shock after February 24. There is also a huge sympathy and an historically entrenched solidarity with Finland that has played a huge role in leading to this extremely hasty and unprepared decision to apply for membership in NATO. Who can say whether this is right or wrong? What I think is clear is that it totally abdicates an entire space for thinking social democratically about foreign policy. This is now gone. It will have enormous ramifications in interior politics. So one of the things that we learned today is about a Turkish demand for extraditing an unknown number of unknown names of mainly Kurdish, Turkish alleged terrorists. I don't know who they are. We do not know who they are, but most of whom are probably Kurdish dissenters in Sweden. It appears that some of those people are people who are even, or at least it appears that Turkey has in these negotiations included people who are in fact elected to parliament, who are politically active in Sweden. There are a lot of Kurdish people in the Social Democratic Party. So this is now a huge issue which was not foreseen at the moment of hastily, due to circumstances, coming to the conclusion that the way of preserving security for Sweden was to apply for membership in NATO. So that was an unforeseen that I think will really have extremely messy ramifications. What I think is more striking is the ease with which 50, 60, 100 years of thinking about what neutrality means, because neutrality was never just a passive stance. Neutrality in the Cold War era was an active stance. It was about being part of the so-called non-aligned movement. It was about trying to think about futures for a world that were beyond the future of the bipolar system. And I find it quite breathtaking, really, that whole legacy of reflection was not at all present. And it cannot be said that it was absent, because there were certainly very vocal critics with long-standing positions in social democracy who outspokenly said we need to think about this, because this is a situation that is very reminiscent of the Cold War situation. But I find it amazing that there was not, how to put it, the habit of thinking about foreign policy as something that is beyond a bipolar worldview, that is beyond a 1990s end of history argument, and as something that also necessarily involves thinking about a world that is much larger than NATO. And so my real fear is that this is now a firm way, whether this turns out to be right or wrong, I cannot say, I'm not sure. But my real fear is that it completely closes down an entire field for thinking more aggressively, offensively about what Sweden can do to be in the world the way that the world clearly is going to look, which is a not very pleasant place, a place in which there are threats that we thought were gone, but that were not gone. And that, I think, is a real problem, and it will really spill over, I think, to the election in ways that are unforeseeable, some of them probably tragic, and that could, I think, be there for a very long time.
And that could be a discussion, much longer discussion for another day in and of itself, Jenny. But many thanks today for this conversation about the demands facing social democracy and the coming decade. You've been listening to Jenny Andersson, the Professor of the History of Political Thought at Uppsala University. And many thanks, Jennifer, and to everyone who's been listening, and goodbye.